Hello, friends. Today, I'm going to discuss Augustine of Hippo's The City of God. The City of God is perhaps his most consequential writing. It is a massive philosophy of history, and it's a work that has governed Western Christian thinking on matters of government and of war and peace since it was written. The City of God was written as an apology for Christianity following the sack of Rome in 410. The sack of Rome in 410 was a profound shock to Christians. Augustine, at this time, was living in Hippo. He was the bishop of Africa, and he heard the accusation that Christianity was responsible for the sack of Rome. That was a very common accusation. Rome was supposed to be the eternal city. It was supposed to be around forever. It was the biggest empire that the world had ever known. And here it seemed to be coming to an end, at least in the western part of Europe. Theodosius had outlawed paganism in 391, and many pagans argued that Christianity feminized Roman men. So they were no longer able to stand up to the ferocity of the barbarians. And Augustine wrote The City of God to defend Christianity against the charge that Christians were responsible for the demise of Rome. And in this book, there's a massive philosophy of history. There's also a massive critique of paganism. Augustine was very proud of being Roman, just like Paul. He was very proud of being Roman, and he acknowledged admirable qualities in the early Romans who had built the empire. Augustine marvels about the beauty of the human body and of the human mind and of human life and of human political structures. But he gives us a blistering and uncompromising portrait of paganism. Paganism is bad. It is a perversion of religion, and we should not participate in it. And it really is destructive of human life and of human politics. But Augustine's view of empires is that they bring about human justice. They bring about a measure of justice. It's not a perfect justice, but it is a measure of justice on this earth, and therefore we should be grateful to them. But all empires are built on crimes, on theft, on violence. Empires are like gangs on a grand scale. So he had a complex view of empire, including the Roman Empire. Not all good, but not all bad either. In a fallen world, they are necessary, but they're not going to bring about perfect justice. They are not going to bring about the kingdom. Augustine, as we've talked about, had a deep appreciation for classical philosophy, especially for Cicero and Plato, but he said that classical philosophers set for themselves the wrong goal. Philosophy cannot bring us happiness. The goal of philosophy is to make human beings happy. And philosophers had this conceit that if we followed their philosophy, that we can attain happiness. And philosophers also taught, the Greco-Roman philosophers, that humans have a right to end their own lives if they cannot achieve happiness. And you see lots and lots of suicides in the Greco-Roman world, a lot of defensive suicide. Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide. Seneca commits suicide. Lucretia commits suicide. I mean, the list goes on and on. Augustine said this is irrational. Happiness cannot be achieved in this life. We have moments where we are content, but they are fleeting moments. And he said, if you really follow classical philosophers to their logical conclusion, we would all commit suicide. Even if you're happy now, you know your happiness is going to end. It's temporary. And life is just full of hardships that interfere with our happiness. Now, some people would say Augustine had a bleak view of life. Others will say he has a realistic view of life. We cannot achieve happiness. Our bodies are unreliable. They break down, they get sick, they betray us. Nature is unreliable. It's too hot in the summer, it's too cold in the winter. We're never really comfortable. Even pets are unreliable. They'll turn on you, they'll bite you. And human beings are unreliable. Our friends are unreliable. They betray us, they disappoint us. So we have fleeting moments of satisfaction, but really those moments of satisfaction are consolations in a life that is full of disasters. And the fact that we cannot be happy in this world there's a profound spiritual meaning in that. We are not made for this world. We are made for another world. And in that world, we will find happiness. Augustine wrote that there are two kinds of societies that coexist in the world. One society is oriented toward the love of God or of eternal things, and it's built on caritas. Caritas can be translated charity, but I think a better translation is love. And then there's another society that's oriented toward the love of this world, earthly things, and it's built on pride. Here in this earth, the city of God and the city of man are mingled together, and they live out their lives upon this earth, and they will be separated at the last judgment. The parable of the wheat and the tares is really important for Augustine. The wheat will not be separated from the tares in this world. The wheat and the tares will only be separated at the last judgment, and it's something that's going to be done by God. It's not our job to separate the wheat from the tares. The world has its end, the construction of a holy society. It is for this end that everything exists. The church is destined to become this holy society. Note, he doesn't say the church is this holy society. It is destined to become this holy society. Christian revelation exists to build up this society, which is to become divine. But Christian revelation exists also to preserve creation, so that this holy society can be formed. The polis, for Augustine, has a positive function. It preserves God's creation by restraining evil and by providing law and peace. Now, so that's his theoretical underpinnings. Now I'm going to talk specifically about what he wrote about the Roman Empire. He said the Roman Empire, like all empires, is built on pride. Roman emperors possessed energy and courage, and they greatly benefited the Mediterranean world. They pacified the world. They brought universal communication. They made possible the spread of the gospel. They mingled cities and peoples in an unprecedented way. So there's much that's really good about Rome. But all empires are nonetheless brutal and criminal, and all empires are destined to fall. Rome is destined to fall, just like all other previous empires are destined to fall. If Augustine were alive today, he would say the United States is destined to fall. It is not an eternal entity. It will break apart. The Pax Americana seems to have come to an end. The Pax Americana that existed after World War II seems to have come to an end. It was It was a good thing. It was an impressive achievement, but in the course of creating of the Pax Americana, the United States committed a lot of crimes, and there was a lot of brutality. But the United States of America is destined to fall. That's what Augustine would say. But we are nonetheless called to respect the polis and defend it against anarchy and barbarism. There's a story about a general. After the sack of Rome, he went to Augustine. He said, I want to just give up fighting. I want to become a monk. Augustine said, no. Your responsibility, your calling in life is to defend the polis. We are to defend the citadels of civilization that we are born into. And Augustine would say, yes, you should protect, you should defend the United States, but you should never forget that the United States, like all countries, is built on human pride, and it contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. It is not an eternal entity. It will come to an end. The church will never come to an end, though. The church will outlast empires. So Augustine's philosophy of history: empires rise and fall. The church will survive the destruction of empire. Empires are united by love of domination. I'll change that spelling. Love, L-O-V-E, of domination. Empires are united by a life devoted to conquest and praise, but they are destined to fall apart. Empires are built on splendid vices. Christians in the city of God make use of the peace of Babylon. Christians seek the peace of the earthly city. The city of God is predestined to eternal life in God, and the city of man is predestined to destruction. This does not mean that the church is all good and the polis is all bad. Both the church and the polis are mixtures of wheat and tares. And it is only God who can really separate the wheat and tares, and this will come at the last judgment. Now, Augustine said some very interesting things about property. After his conversion, Augustine sold all that he had and he gave it to the poor. But Augustine did not say that all people have to do this. A vow of poverty is not essential to salvation. We can own property and we can enjoy our wealth, but it can very easily become an idol. Riches can be a chain, and it's better not to have them. Wealth is spiritually dangerous. And wealthy Christians must be very careful that they possess their riches but are not possessed by them. So this is kind of a warning to those of us who are in secular life, that we can possess wealth, but we cannot be possessed by wealth. Just war theory. Now, Augustine did not find in the Bible a just war theory. I mean, you can look in the Bible, you can see passages that say, kill every man, woman, and child, leave everyone dead. You can also see the Sermon on the Mount, which has an ethic of turning the other cheek, an ethic of pacifism. So Augustine turned to Cicero and to Plato to get a just war theory. And the first 7 of these points come right out of Cicero. The intent of war is to secure peace. There should be no war for warfare's sake. War must vindicate justice. It must be defensive. An armed attack upon a peaceful people is inadmissible. War must be waged under proper authority. Only the prince can declare war. You cannot get together a militia and decide you are going to declare war on someone who has wronged you. It is only the prince that has the authority to declare war. And the soldiers have the responsibility to obey the prince. War should be a last resort after all other options are exhausted. The conduct of war must be just. There should be no wanton violence. There should be no profanation of churches. There should be no massacres or conflagrations. Vengeance, atrocities, and reprisals are forbidden, and non-combatants are immune. Soldiers should fight other soldiers. They should not commit atrocities against non-combatants. Proportionality. The harm done by fighting a war should not be greater than the harm that would be done by not fighting. I remember when England in the 1980s invaded the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are some windswept islands off the coast of Argentina. And Argentina took over the Falkland Islands. They belonged to England. Margaret Thatcher sent a whole fleet, her whole navy down there to Argentina, and they had a war that killed thousands of people just to recover these Falkland Islands. And I remember a lot of Americans saying, look, the harm you're doing by going to war to get these islands back is much greater than the harm that would be done by just letting Argentina have them. So, you know, there's a debate about that. I mean, I'm sure England had was worried about the precedent this was setting. You know, and the invasion of Iraq is, most people, I think, today would say that the harm that the United States did by invading Iraq is greater than the harm of not invading. There were harms. Saddam Hussein was a wicked totalitarian dictator. So there were harms involved in doing nothing. But the harms that we created by going into Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein, many people would argue were greater than the harm that would be done by just doing nothing. So, you know, proportionality, you have to run a calculus when you go to war. Probable success, you better be sure that you're going to win, or you better be fairly certain that you're going to win. It is not good to fight a war if you're going to lose. You're just going to cause a lot of grief for yourself and a lot of other people. Now, the last two, mournful manner and loving disposition, these are specifically Christian. This is how Augustine baptized the just war theory. He said that we should not be gleeful about war or prideful about war. We should always realize this is very serious business. We should go to war with a mournful disposition. We are going to be killing people who are made in God's image. And we should always love our enemies, even in the midst of the war. So this is how Augustine uses or weaves the Sermon on the Mount into his just war theory. We should respect soldiers who we capture, treat them with civility. And so there was during the Middle Ages, there was a lot of warfare in Europe, but in many, many cases, it was much more civil than warfare is today, because both sides, they implemented these principles of the just war theory. Now, you notice that the just war theory is really a theory of almost no war. There's really only two options for Christians, I think Augustine would say. One is no war at all, do not participate in war. That was the position of the early church. The other option is almost no war. This is a pretty high bar. You do not go to war lightly, and you have to really consider it with great deliberation and it's a very grave matter. Augustine actually really hated war and wrote a lot about how much chaos and senseless violence and retaliation war brings. So he really warned against it. But Augustine did not believe that pacifism was possible in this world. Swords had never been beaten into plowshares and never would. Peace is not possible in history, only beyond history. So we are going to have to deal with this question about whether to go to war or not. And we should think clearly about it. And that's why he set down these principles. Now, two other matters I just want to end with are these heresies that Augustine had to confront as bishop. One is the Donatist heresy. This was a North African heresy. The Donatists had whitewashed churches, and they were a purist group. They said that the Catholics are too sinful. You should not be a member of their church, and you should be rebaptized in our church. They said your salvation is dependent upon being rebaptized in our congregations, which are pure. They also taught that the sacraments, baptism and communion, are worthless unless the moral standing of the priest is, unless the priest is in good moral standing. Sacraments are worthless. Augustine opposed the Donatists vigorously. He debated them in many venues. He basically argued that the church in a fallen world is a hospital for sinners. It is not a communion of saints. It is destined to become a communion of saints, but it is not a communion of saints. And that the sacraments are God's gift to us. They're not dependent upon the moral standing of the priest. And so Augustine had quite a different view of church from the Donatists. And in the end, the Donatists were wiped out. Actually, the Roman emperor sent. There were little groups of Donatists who were committing acts of terror, but the Roman emperor eventually sent some troops and wiped them out. The Pelagians are another group of people that Augustine argued vigorously against. Pelagius was a monk who had a moral theory of the atonement. Now, what that means is that Pelagius believed that Jesus set a moral example for us to follow. And that's what salvation consisted in. Salvation consisted in following Jesus's example. Augustine thought there was too much emphasis on human effort, too much emphasis on works, and not enough emphasis on grace. Salvation is a miracle for Augustine, offered to sinners who were repentant, and sinners who recognized that they could not achieve salvation on their own, that God had to reach in and change our hearts. So the Pelagians and the Donatists were both condemned as heretics, and Augustine's view on these issues became normative for Christians, and still are normative for Christians. Okay, well, that's all I have to say. I will see you next Wednesday for your midterm. Take care and have a good week.